Hi everyone, welcome to MGF 5928. We are in week 6, and this week what we're looking at is the role of top management teams and defining who they are and what they do. So realistically, these teams are at the very top of the organisation, they are at the apex, they are also driving the strategic decision making, and they are also filtering or bringing into account the contexts that come into play. So for example, the environment, the organisation, the board and the CEO, and how all of these aspects may influence the strategic decision making overall. So they're a bit of a moderating role at the end of the day. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Also, what you need to think about this week is you've got a submission due for your case debrief and reflection report. That's due by Friday 4 p.m. So don't forget to do that. Don't forget that you need to focus on the questions that are in the brief and not the questions that are for your learning. For your learning within the topic, they actually guide some of the directions that you should go in your thinking, but the brief is specifically those 3 questions that you need to answer. The other thing you should be thinking about doing is your strategic report. Perfect world, you might have your first draft, be working on your first draft or completed your first draft. And drawing in a lot of the information that we have covered over the previous week's learning, as well as perhaps reading ahead to see what you can take away from future week's learning that could then inform your analysis. So we're now trying to understand, why should we study top management teams, or TMTs for short? And really, within an organisation, they're quite critical. There are some arguments that they aren't because the CEO is more critical, but there are other arguments that they are because they help disperse and bring a separate degree of knowledge to the top decision-making processes regarding strategy. So what is the importance of studying top management teams? First up is multiple goals. So top management teams aren't consistent. They are not identical in every single organisation. They do, however, address multiple goals of the organisation. So if ultimately an organisation exists to maintain competitive advantage and ensure long-term success, they are all looking at how different aspects of the business within the environment within it exists, and the different multiple goals of each part of the business can then drive into this ultimate area around competitive advantage and also long-term success. They also are the strategy making process. So they are the decision makers for the most part. Yes, some decision making comes from the bottom up, but primarily a lot of it comes from the top down, and they are at the apex of this. So understanding how they approach this decision or strategy making process is really important, because it can understand the organisation better and organisations better in whole and determine best practice. It's also looking at the interaction of them as a group of people, because they're not identical, and where they are homogenous, that can raise a whole bunch of different issues, but the heterogeneity and their backgrounds, their skills, their experiences that they bring can actually ensure that the perspectives that they view in terms of strategic decision making is more broader than perhaps a narrower focus. So their interaction as a group of people, how do they interact with each other within this particular context, as well as how do they look at interacting with other people outside the organisation. Then we've got role differentiation. So what is the role of the top management team? How does that differ, or how does that is similar to other roles within the organisation? What is the relationship like to the CEO and also to the board of directors? And also, how does these roles actually exist within the context of a changing or transformative organisation as well in terms of strategy? Where does power lie, for instance? Who has more power? The parts of the organisation that brings revenue in and that is represented by their executive, or other parts of the business that help ensure that it ticks along and that things flow smoothly. So looking at the role differentiation is also important, and also the organisational outcomes. So different skill sets are needed depending on what is the ultimate outcome of the organisation, and profiling this within the top management team or the executive leadership team or the senior management. There's a whole bunch of names, but they're basically the same thing. Understanding these particular teams can also understand how decisions are made in regard to what is the outcome and how to deliver that outcome overall. This leads into 3 areas in particular that we should look at in regards to the top management team. The first part is the composition. So how similar or how different are the profiles of the top management team? The second part is the structure. So what are the roles within the top management team? How independent are they on each other? And also how big is the top management team? And lastly is the process. How is process managed by the top management team? So what is the social integration aspects of it, and how is consensus managed, or in fact the opposite, how is dealing with disagreement managed within this team as well? Okay, so here's a basic model of a top management team. So let's go through. We've got our contextual factors, and we've looked at the environment, we've looked at the organisation, the structure, the way it's set up, the employment, the size, the industry, all of that can have a play. And lastly, we've also looked at the CEO. What kind of CEO is there? Does this CEO encourage innovation? Is the CEO afraid of risk? That can all have an influence on the top management team. So within that top management team, I briefly mentioned before the concept of composition, of structure, and of process, and this is where you see it. How are these top management teams made up? How do they exist? And in what kind of format do they work? This then leads into the strategic decision-making process. So if the CEO's got the vision and the top management team is to come up with the corporate strategies that drive the direction of the organisation, how do they make their decisions within this? So what is the formulation? Do they draw on some generic strategies? How do they customise it? How do the scope of their experience come into it? And then also, how is it implemented or operationalised? How do they develop the plans that can bring this to life? Once again, once the decisions are made, it's usually presented back to the CEO and perhaps the board. And then it's also influenced again by the environment, the organisation and the CEO. So that could then change or tweak the format of the decision-making process or the decision-making outcomes in relation to formulation and implementation. And lastly, this leads to the outcome. So what is the strategy, and how do we believe or forecast or plan for this to influence firm performance, hopefully in a positive way? And that's how a model of the top management teams can actually work within the organisation and take into account those contextual factors that it needs to. Okay, so who's actually in the top management group? It's a relatively small group of executives. Normally it's those that combined can give a collective view over the whole organisation. And that's what's known as the strategic apex. They're at the very point or apex of the organisation, but they understand, coming from their different areas, what is involved in terms of creating value for the organisation. So basically, it's the overall responsibility for the organisation as stated by Henry Mintzberg. It's fairly straightforward. They're the ones in charge. All managers are identified by the CEO as belonging to the TMT. So not all managers within an organisation will belong to the top management team. Only the top echelon of managers will, and not all areas are represented individually. So for example, it's often quite common to see that central services, whether finance, is actually also including IT, for example, and that feeds into that. So every organisation will have a different group to what their different idea or different representation of what their top group looks like, but ultimately it will have representatives from key aspects of the organisations who are in charge of their different sections. It can also include inside board members, so anyone who is sitting on the board and is also employed sits within the organisation as well. Within a very large corporate sense, it could be at the vice president level and higher. So that is the vice president of operations, the vice president of marketing, the vice president of HR, and so on. And it could also be the 2 highest executive levels. And once again, this really varies from organisation to organisation. If you're in a small organisation, you might only keep it to the 1 level. If you're in a large organisation, you might have 2 levels, which could still be a considerable amount, particularly if you're looking at organisations that have more than 20,000 employees. Also included in that could be the founders of the organisation, where they sit on the top management team, particularly if they have a day-to-day role within the business. And at the most simplest level, who is getting paid the most? They might be are representatives of the top management team, because it'd be very rare in an organisation to actually pay people more who are not on the top management team. Having said that, there are often sometimes specialist niches. So for example, if you have such a specialist technical skill set that is very difficult to find and replace in the marketplace, then those individuals might be commanding a premium on their salary. Okay, so power in an organisation is often unequal, and there's consideration of the power differences that need to be taken into account. What we know is, though, that the power is central to strategic choice. So often those that are more powerful can actually drive the strategic decision making in the direction that they want to move. And in some instances, executives can join up to form a power block in the case, and therefore combining their individual powers together, they can then drive through their preferred options. Research on power is actually quite important for top management. First up, it's central to the strategic choice. It's also well established that strategic decisions are often really unstructured and ambiguous. So people draw on their experience a lot. They draw on aspects that they've filtered through from the information that they receive. And looking at the distribution of power overall, the impact of experiences and personality can also play a role. So it's important to use a fairly broad definition of power, measuring the power of top management team members. And we can split it down into 4 key areas. The first is structural. They are given the power. The second is prestige. They have developed the power. The third is ownership. They might have an owning aspect within the business, so therefore the power comes with that. And the fourth is expertise. They have deep knowledge of a certain area, so therefore they can speak with power about it. Okay, so when we're looking at the interactions within the top management teams, we can see that the structure of the top management team, whether it's the role interdependence and the size, can have an effect on the composition, and particularly in relation to heterogeneity. So heterogeneity is basically how different they are. Homogeneity is how similar they are, okay? So where they are more different, where there is greater demographic heterogeneity, so basically based on demographics, the people are different, there is greater cognitive heterogeneity because they're drawing in on different skills and experiences. The other aspect to think about here is where there is greater demographic heterogeneity, there is also less degree of social interaction. So now we start to go into the process aspect where there is social integration and leading to consensus. So the more heterogeneous the top management team is, the less likely they are to be socially integrated because they're all coming from different perspectives. And the greater the cognitive or thinking aspect of heterogeneity, so how well or how similar they are together, also the less degree of social integration there is. So heterogeneity and its effect on social integration is that it is more likely to have a less degree. The less degree of social integration, the more heterogeneous the group is. This also leads into the concept that the greater the heterogeneity of within the top management team, the less the degree of consensus, okay? So they're less likely to agree on certain issues, for example. And the greater the social integration within TMTs, the greater the degree of consensus. So where you've got a more homogeneous composition, they are more likely to be socially integrated and therefore they are more likely to have consensus. Another factor to take into account is the size. So now we're going back to the structure aspect and we're looking at the size. So for example, the larger the size of the TMT, the greater degree of cognitive heterogeneity. So the more people that there are in there, the more chance is that you'll get different aspects and different ways of thinking within the top management team. The larger the size of the TMT, the less degree of social integration. That means the more people they are, they're probably less likely to form one cohesive group. And the larger the size of the TMTs, the less degree of consensus. So the more people there are, agree on a decision or gain consensus overall. So I guess the final point to take away in all of this is the relationship of power within the construct of the top management team and how they interact with each other. So the effects of the TMT heterogeneity, so the degree of which it is different, on other characteristics of TMTs are stronger when the relative power of each member of the TMT is factored into the computation of heterogeneity. So where power comes in, the heterogeneity actually becomes more diverse, and this leads to the relative power of individual levels needing to be factored in as well. The CEO has a relationship to the top management team, obviously, and that can occur in 3 different ways. First up, they set the stage for the team interactions. So they are the one who might encourage open discussion and also dispute resolution. The CEO also has a strong vision for the company and where they want the organisation to go and what they want the success to look like. Third, the CEO's degree of charisma can also play a part, particularly with direct reports, and that's what the top management team, they are a direct report to the CEO. And where the charisma comes into play, where a CEO is more charismatic, they are actually more likely to secure extra commitment and effort from the top management team. So the research on charisma is actually really interesting, particularly in relation to understanding the top management team dynamics. Okay, so there are some contexts which does impact the top management team and what their characteristics are of this team. So the first one is environment, the second one is the organisation, and the third one is the CEO. So when we're looking at environment, what we're looking at is how complex is the environment, because usually what happens is the more complex the environment, the greater the heterogeneity, so the more that the team is actually different from each other. Secondly, the more complex the environment, the larger the size. That's because people are bringing in specific skill sets that have to be able to read this environment better. Okay, what this also leads into is instability. And this means that basically where an environment is unstable, that actually brings in a certain circumstance for the top management team as well, and can influence the structure and characteristics of the team. So the more unstable the environment, the greater the heterogeneity, because they've got to bring in people with different skill sets, for example, and the more unstable, the larger the size. So really where you've got complexity and you've got instability, it does affect the makeup of the top management team. This also can have an effect based on the environmental munificence. And the munificent environments help buffer organisations from external threats and enable them to accumulate slack resources. And it means having these resources at hand that can offer flexibility and growth opportunities. That can also mean that the top management team is influenced by that. So where consensus plays a part in a munificent environment, generally non-threatening conditions do facilitate agreement. However, where munificence offers TMTs a wide breadth of choices, so they have lots of options, there might be more diversity of opinion, there is more likely to be disagreement. So when we're looking at the organisation, there are 2 key aspects of where strategy and organisation performance can determine the TMT characteristics. So for example, with the interdependence of a firm's diversification posture, so how diverse the firm is, we can see that there is less heterogeneity within the top management team. There is a greater role of interdependence within the top management team. There is a greater degree of social integration within the top management team, and there is a greater degree of consensus within the top management team. So where they depend on each other more in order to create the firm's diversification posture, they actually have these factors of less heterogeneity, more interdependence of roles, greater social integration, and greater degrees of consensus. Okay, so that's really quite interesting with all that. And also when we're looking at the size of the top management team, where there is greater interdependence of the diversification posture, there is more likely to have a larger top management team. Also thinking about it from a strategic perspective, where they either are following defender roles or prospector roles will also have a part. And really have a read through of the propositions 5 to 6A, 6B, 5 to 6C and 6D, as this explains what happens in certain strategies for defenders. So for example, for firms pursuing defender strategies, so protecting their spot in the marketplace, exhibit less top management team heterogeneity. They're more likely to be similar than the prospector firms. And if you go through that, it actually makes a lot of sense in terms of looking at when they're following defender strategies, they might have less people on the top management team, they might have more social integration than, say, prospector firms, and they also might exhibit more consensus. That's because they have a different playbook to a firm that is trying to drive prospects. And the last part of strategy is looking at the amount of strategic change to take place. Where there is a lot of strategic change to take place, they're more likely to have a heterogeneous top management team. Where there is a lot of change to take place, the degree of role interdependence is less, so they are more independent. Another one with greater amount of strategic change, there is also the top management team is likely to be larger. And where there is a greater amount of strategic change, the less degree of consensus. There's more likely to be disagreement. And another aspect is the organisational performance. So where they are high organisational performance and very, very low organisational performance, you are likely to have a larger top management team. Where there is a moderate level, then there's more likely to have fewer members within the top management team. This also applies of high and low organisational performance can have an effect on role interdependence. So under the conditions of low and high organisation performance, role interdependence with TMTs is low. And then when organisation performance is at a moderate level, role interdependence is actually at its greatest. Once again, when we're looking at social integration, where they've got very low and very high levels of organisation performance, then social integration within top management teams is actually quite low. And when organisation performance is moderate, then social integration is usually greater. And lastly, where you've got very low and very high organisation performance levels, then consensus within the TMT is generally low. But where there is moderate levels of performance, then consensus is actually at its greatest. Okay, CEOs also have an effect on the top management team characteristics. And there's two ways that they do that. The first one is through biases and preferences, and the second one is through CEO power. So when we're looking at the concept of this, what we're actually trying to do is determine how much of the CEO from a bias and preference perspective can actually influence the top management team. So where the CEO is actually quite open, there's greater heterogeneity to the TMT team, so the top management team. So the CEO actually wants to hear different perspectives. And the greater level of the CEO openness, the more likely that the top management team is going to be larger. Where the CEO has been in tenure for a long time, the weaker the relationships between the CEO openness and heterogeneity and size. So basically looking at the concept of they've been there for a while, there's probably less openness and therefore the heterogeneity may not be as broad and the size may be smaller. And the longer the CEO's tenure, generally speaking, the less heterogeneity within the top management team. So the longer that they've been there, they're more likely to cherry pick out the people that they work best with, for example, and they remain part of the senior management team or the top management team. Where a CEO is quite dominant within the organisation, there'll probably be less heterogeneity or less difference in the makeup or structure of the top management team. Where the CEO is quite dominant as well, there might be a larger size of TMTs because what can actually happen is they can encourage the TMT to bring different perspectives, but ultimately they're the ones with the power. Where the CEO is dominant, the less degree of consensus within the TMTs, so the top management team is actually less likely to agree and less relevant is the consensus, so to the organisational outcomes because the CEO is overriding this with what they want to have or their dominance. Okay, so out of all of this, the consequences of the top management team's interaction, we have three aspects to look at here. The first one is the consequences of TMTs on strategic decision making. Basically what we're saying here, and to summarise, is the quality of strategic decisions is positively associated with TMT heterogeneity and the size, and negatively associated with social integration. So basically where their team is more diverse and probably larger, they're actually going to come to better strategic decisions, but you won't have the social integration into play. And the second key aspect of this is that where there is effectiveness of strategy implementation process, this is where social integration and consensus is positively associated. So this is where the social integration and consensus can be quite helpful, But however, you will have negative associations between strategy implementation effectiveness and the heterogeneity, the top management team's heterogeneity and its size. So when you're implementing, social integration and consensus is more important. When you're making the decisions, heterogeneity and size will mean better quality decision making. When we're looking at the consequences of TMTs or top management teams on strategy, there's no real clear findings in this space. There's a lot of different studies presenting a lot of different outcomes, but overall, there's no one specific path that is absolute. Generally, what Finkelstein et al. Has talked about here is that the direct relationships between TMT heterogeneity and strategic choices are unlikely to be robust. So that basically means that there's not a lot of strength between heterogeneity and strategic choices, or it might not be as strong as it could be. Okay, it can also look at the heterogeneity and social interaction, and during the strategic decision making and affect how the formulation and implementation processes development. So really, as a result of all this, it's important to study the relationships between heterogeneity, between social integration and strategic decision making, because depending on how you structure your studies and your knowledge of this can actually affect what you find based on this. It's also worth considering the fact that you need to think about it more broadly in relation to social capital networks, and also the TMT functioning overall. So there's no clear consequence as such. There's just a whole bunch of different perspectives that have been noted, and that this can have an impact, and what the degree of that impact is on strategic choices we're not completely certain of. And when we're looking at the consequences of top management team interaction and firm performance, what we actually can note is that the more unstable the environment, the more positive the relationship between heterogeneity and firm performance. That means that basically it's better to have a very diverse team or a heterogeneous team, not a homogeneous team, running the place, because you're more likely to have a positive outcome on firm performance because you're broadly evaluating the options better. Secondly, the more unstable the environment, the more negative the relationship between TMT, social integration, and firm performance. So what happens here is that you're less likely to have that social integration, partly because you might have a more heterogeneous team, but also partly that you're not likely to have consensus because the environment and the way people view the environment based on their experiences and knowledge and skills can offer different perspectives that they feel are important when determining strategic decisions in relation to the firm's performance. So these are a couple of factors that you do need to take into account when you're looking at firm performance. Okay, so what this chapter has done is try and outline what top management teams are, what they do to a degree from a strategic perspective, and also what influences their interactions and their profiles, and how the element of power exists within this. A couple of things to note is that TMTs need very clear explication and theoretical treatment in terms of the boundaries. So understanding what are the boundaries of top management teams, what can they do and what can't they do, is quite important. A second issue is how to treat the CEO in determination to TMT level measures. So not all members of a top management team are actually equal, and most empirical treatments kind of treat them that way, but that's not always the case. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. And the third issue is that capturing the heterogeneity of the TMT team. This is actually quite difficult to do, because on what measurements do you base this? And given that the profile of typical top management teams might actually present at top value as quite similar. So also capturing things like interpersonal relationships as well as diversity as well can lead to different hypotheses within this. So I guess at the end of the day, while there is a lot of work on top management teams, and we've highlighted some of the aspects that have come out of this research, there's still a lot more research that needs to be done, particularly in transformative environments. So that's about it for me on this chapter. I will speak to you soon.